How did your psycho ex become so obsessed with you they ruined their own life? My ex-boyfriend Tyson proposed to me on my birthday, just hours after he slept with my sister. Worst part was, everyone knew about the cheating. My mom, my friends, even my distant relatives. Yet no one told me until 6 months into planning the wedding, when one of the bridesmaids drunkenly exposed it all. I broke things off immediately and told him to get his stuff out of my apartment within the week. Tyson tried apologizing, crying, begging, promising it wasn't what it sounded like. When none of that worked, he got angry. Fine, let's break up, but I want the ring back. My eyes widened at the audacity. Wait, so you cheat on me with my sister, and now you want my dead mom's ring? Which, by the way, was something you got for free from my dad. He nodded. Yeah, that's the ring. Get out, NOW. Before I call the cops, I warned him. He stepped out of the front door with his box, then paused. So, the ring... I slammed the door shut on his face and locked it. Why did he want the ring so badly? That was 3 months ago. And since then, Tyson still hadn't stopped demanding that I give him the ring. He sent me texts every day about how unfair I was acting, how his new girlfriend, aka my sister, deserved to wear my mom's ring too. She would have wanted your sister to be happy, he tried explaining. I quickly blocked his number after that, but it only made things worse. He started showing up at my work during lunch, asking coworkers to convince me to do the right thing and give him the ring. When I'd say no, he'd call me bitter and vindictive for keeping something to remember him by. Which is ironic because for the past 3 months, all I wanted was to finally move on from one of the worst things to ever happen to me. But it felt like he was never gonna let that happen. All over this ring. Why? I got my answer when my friend Jane suggested I take a break and join her on her girls' trip for the weekend. It's 3 days away from all this Tyson madness, she persuaded me. Before I left, I called my dad asking if he could stay at my apartment and watch over my orange cat while I was gone. Sure thing, sweetie, he told me gently, and so I left. I posted photos of my packed bags, letting the world know that I was finally moving forward. I spent the next few days laying out on the beach, making new friends, hiking. I was genuinely happy for the first time in months. I wasn't thinking about Tyson. I wasn't thinking about the ring. I was finally healing. But what I didn't know was that Tyson had been waiting for an opportunity like this, obsessively watching my Instagram. He'd created a fake account after I blocked him and knew my apartment would be empty all weekend. The ring could finally be his. That Sunday at 2 a.m., I got a call from the police. I cut the girls' trip short and immediately drove 4 hours back to the apartment. My heart raced the entire time, wondering what could have happened. The police waved me over once I arrived and refused to let me enter the apartment. It's real bad in there, he explained, shaking his head. 12 years in law enforcement. You'd think I'd seen it all. Just as I felt even more anxious, he started spilling everything. Apparently, Tyson showed up at my apartment at 11 p.m. and parked 2 blocks away so the neighbors wouldn't recognize his car. He walked up to the porch and started peeking into each window. He then walked around the entire house, checking from window to window before coming back to the front door. Then he pulled out a lockpick kit he'd bought online and went to work. It took him almost 20 minutes, but he was determined to get his hands on the ring. When it finally opened, he stepped inside and went straight for my bedroom. He knew I kept my jewelry box in the top drawer of my dresser. He started digging through, looking so desperately for the ring that he didn't notice the footsteps growing closer in the hallway. My dad, who volunteered to take care of my cat, had heard the lock getting picked and moved silently down the hall. When he noticed the intruder heading straight to my bedroom, my dad's marine instincts kicked in. He quietly stepped into the doorway and said in the calmest voice, "Don't make any sudden movements if you want to live. Now turn around slowly and put your hands where I can see them." Tyson, being the bright man that he is, decided to grab the nearest, heaviest object and throw it at my dad before trying to run past him. That was his first mistake. The rest, you'll have to see for yourself. The police officer frowned, leading me past the yellow tape to see the gruesome aftermath myself. I'll be honest, it was a miracle Tyson had even survived. The doctors who treated his wounds said he'll live, but the damage to his body had been severe. But the nightmare wasn't over. The detectives called me, saying they found something in the trunk of Tyson's car that they want me to see. When I asked what it was, the detective could only apologize over and over, saying that he couldn't say it over the phone. When I saw it, I finally realized why he wanted the ring. The detective pulled out his tablet and swiped to a photo of papers spread across the trunk floor. My eyes locked onto an insurance policy with my name forged at the bottom, claiming Tyson owned my mother's ring as a gift from my dad during our engagement. The signature looked nothing like mine, but someone had tried hard to copy it. Next to the policy sat a business card for a place called Eric's Pawn and Jewelry, with a date scribbled on the back in Tyson's handwriting, exactly 2 days after this weekend when he thought I'd be gone. The detective swiped again and showed me a burner phone, the screen filled with texts from an unknown number. The messages got more threatening as they went on, demanding Tyson pay up or provide something valuable as collateral for a loan. The last text, sent 3 days ago, said he had 1 week left before things got ugly. I felt my stomach turn as I stared at the evidence, realizing this whole time Tyson wasn't begging for the ring because he loved my sister or wanted to hurt me. He needed money. Detective Lombard stepped closer and explained they found more documents in a folder under the spare tire, including something called a gift affidavit that claimed my dad had legally transferred ownership of the ring to Tyson as an engagement present. The notary stamp looked official, but she said they already contacted the notary office and confirmed it was fake. Tyson had been building a backup plan in case I refused to hand over the ring, planning to file an insurance claim saying I stole his property. I couldn't believe the level of planning that went into this. The months of harassment suddenly making horrible sense. He wasn't trying to give the ring to my sister at all. He was going to sell it to cover gambling debts, and if that didn't work, he'd commit insurance fraud to get the money anyway. Detective Lombard kept talking, pointing out dates and amounts. But my brain felt fuzzy trying to process that someone I'd planned to marry had been willing to forge documents, break into my home, and commit multiple crimes just to pay off his debts. She mentioned finding betting apps on his phone and records showing he'd lost over $20,000 in the past few months. The loan shark texts lined up perfectly with his losses, painting a picture of someone desperate and spiraling. I asked if my sister knew about any of this, and the detective said they'd be questioning her next, but right now, all evidence pointed to Tyson acting alone. That should have made me feel better, but instead I felt worse, knowing my sister had chosen to be with someone capable of this level of deception without even understanding who he really was. The detective finished showing me the evidence and said I should go somewhere safe for the night while they processed everything. I called my dad and he told me to come straight to his house, that he'd already left my apartment and was waiting for me. The drive over felt surreal, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as I replayed every conversation where Tyson had begged for the ring back. All those times he'd shown up at my work, sent those texts about my sister deserving to wear it, claimed my mom would have wanted her to be happy. None of it had been real. Every word had been manipulation. Every tear had been an act, all building toward his plan to steal the ring the moment I let my guard down. I pulled into Dad's driveway and found him sitting on the porch steps, still wearing the same clothes from earlier, looking exhausted. He stood up when he saw me and pulled me into a tight hug without saying anything. We went inside and he made coffee even though it was almost midnight, both of us too wired to sleep. I sat at his kitchen table and started talking, walking through every moment of the past 3 months, every text message, every lunch break confrontation at work, every time Tyson had made me feel guilty for keeping my own mother's ring. Dad listened without interrupting, his jaw getting tighter with each detail I shared. When I finished, he said he felt like an idiot for giving Tyson the ring to propose with in the first place, for trusting someone who turned out to be such a skilled liar. I told him it wasn't his fault, that Tyson had fooled both of us, but I could see the guilt sitting heavy on his shoulders. We stayed up until the sun started coming through the kitchen windows, neither of us able to stop thinking about what could have happened if Dad hadn't been there to stop him. My phone rang at exactly 8 in the morning and I grabbed it fast, seeing Detective Lombard's name on the screen. She said Tyson had made it through surgery and was stable in the hospital, with multiple broken bones including his ribs, left arm, and collarbone, plus some internal injuries that would take months to heal. The doctor said he'd survive, but recovery would be long and painful. I felt this weird mix of relief and anger wash over me. Relief because it meant my dad wouldn't be facing murder charges, that this whole nightmare wouldn't get even worse with a death on his conscience. But anger because Tyson would eventually recover, would eventually walk out of that hospital and continue his life after trying to destroy mine. Detective Lombard must have sensed what I was feeling because she said the district attorney was very interested in prosecuting this case to the fullest extent, that Tyson's injuries didn't change the severity of what he'd done. She asked if I could come to the station later that morning to give a formal statement and review all the evidence they'd collected from both Tyson's car and my apartment. She mentioned they were building a strong case for burglary, attempted theft, forgery, and insurance fraud, listing off charges that made my head spin. I agreed to come in around 10 and hung up, staring at my phone for a long moment before Dad asked if I wanted breakfast. I shook my head no, my stomach still in knots, and said I needed to call my boss first. I dialed work and my boss picked up on the second ring, her voice cheerful and normal in a way that felt jarring against everything happening in my life. I kept my explanation vague, saying I had a family emergency and needed a few days off to handle some personal stuff. I wasn't ready to tell my coworkers that my ex broke into my apartment and got beaten up by my Marine dad. Wasn't ready for the questions and gossip that would follow. My boss didn't push for details, just said to take the whole week if I needed it, and not to worry about anything at the office. Her kindness hit me harder than I expected, and I felt tears building up in my throat, having to clear it twice before I could thank her and hang up. Dad noticed and squeezed my shoulder, telling me it was okay to fall apart a little, that I'd been holding it together for months while Tyson harassed me, and now everything had exploded in one night. I nodded but didn't let myself cry, feeling like if I started I might not stop, and I still had to get through this police statement and whatever came next. At the police station, Detective Lombard led me to a small interview room with a table and recording equipment. She sat across from me with a notepad and asked me to start from the beginning, to walk her through the entire relationship with Tyson. I took a breath and began with how we met 2 years ago, how he'd seemed perfect at first, how my family had welcomed him and my dad had trusted him enough to give him Mom's ring for the proposal. Then I moved into the breakup, explaining how one of my bridesmaids had drunkenly told me about Tyson sleeping with my sister just hours before he proposed. Detective Lombard's pen moved steadily across the page as I described the 3 months of constant harassment after I ended things, the daily texts demanding the ring back, the claims that my sister deserved to wear it, the way he'd twisted everything to make me feel like the bad guy for keeping my own mother's jewelry. I told her about blocking his number and how that only made things worse, how he started showing up at my work during lunch breaks, trying to get my coworkers to convince me to give him the ring. She asked specific questions about dates and times, about whether I'd ever felt physically threatened, about what exactly he'd said during each confrontation. I answered everything as clearly as I could remember, watching her write down notes and occasionally underline certain phrases. After almost an hour of talking, she leaned back and said something that made my chest feel tight. She said this wasn't a random crime or an impulsive decision. This was calculated, planned, something Tyson had been building toward for months while pretending to care about sentiment and my sister's feelings. Detective Lombard pulled up security footage on her computer and turned the monitor toward me. I watched grainy black and white video of my apartment building's parking lot, something I didn't even know existed. The timestamp showed 9:47 on Sunday night, and there was Tyson's car, circling the block once, twice, 3 times before finally parking 2 streets over where the neighbors wouldn't recognize his vehicle. The detective fast-forwarded, and I saw him walking toward my building at exactly 11:03, more than an hour after he'd first arrived. He'd spent all that time watching and waiting, making absolutely sure no one was home before he made his move. The footage showed him checking windows, walking around the entire building, coming back to the front door and pulling something from his pocket. Even in the grainy video, I could see him working on my lock, bent over the doorknob for what felt like forever. Detective Lombard said the timestamp showed it took him 19 minutes to pick the lock. 19 minutes of determination to get inside and steal from me. I felt sick watching it, seeing how methodical he'd been, how patient. This wasn't someone acting out of emotion or desperation in the moment. This was someone who'd planned every detail, who'd studied my routines and waited for the perfect opportunity. The evidence tech knocked and came in carrying a folder of photos. Detective Lombard spread them across the table, and I saw pictures of the lockpick set they'd found in Tyson's pocket after my dad stopped him. The tools were still in their Amazon packaging, barely used, with a receipt showing he'd ordered them 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. The detective pointed at the date and said this proved premeditation beyond any doubt. Tyson hadn't made some impulsive bad decision in a moment of weakness. He'd actively prepared for this break-in, purchasing tools, practicing with them, planning his approach well in advance. She showed me more photos of his car's interior, the insurance documents laid out in order, the pawn shop appointment written clearly on that business card. Every piece of evidence painted the same picture of someone who'd spent months manipulating me and weeks preparing to commit multiple felonies. I stared at the photos and felt this strange disconnect, like I was looking at evidence of a crime committed by a stranger instead of someone I'd almost married. Detective Lombard gathered up the photos and said the district attorney wanted to meet with me, that she was very interested in this case given all the evidence they'd collected. The door opened and a woman in a dark suit walked in, extending her hand with a professional smile. She introduced herself as Elena Stowe, the assistant district attorney who would be handling Tyson's case. She sat down next to Detective Lombard and explained that given the evidence of premeditation, the forgery, the insurance fraud scheme, they were looking at serious felony charges that could result in significant prison time. Her voice was professional but warm, making it clear that she saw me as the victim here, and the state would be pursuing this case aggressively, regardless of any pressure I might feel from family members. She asked if anyone had tried to convince me to drop charges or not cooperate with the investigation. I mentioned my sister's dozens of missed calls but said I hadn't spoken to her yet. Elena nodded and said that was probably wise for now, that sometimes family members of defendants tried to minimize what happened or make victims feel guilty for seeking justice. She emphasized that what Tyson did was a crime against the state, not just against me personally, which meant the prosecution would move forward even if I had doubts or concerns. That actually made me feel better, knowing I wouldn't be solely responsible for whatever happened next, that professionals were handling this, and I could focus on recovering rather than managing the legal process alone. Elena pulled out some paperwork and said they'd be in touch soon about next steps, that I should expect this to take several months to work through the court system, but they were confident in their case. She shook my hand again and left, and Detective Lombard walked me out to the parking lot where Dad was waiting in his truck. I climbed in and he asked how it went. I told him they had everything they needed and more, that Tyson had basically documented his own crimes. Dad started the engine and we drove back to his house in silence, both of us processing the fact that this was really happening, that the legal system was taking over now, and all we could do was wait and heal. Before we left the station, Elena pulled out a notepad and asked if I thought my sister knew about Tyson's money problems or his plans to sell the ring. I stared at the table and told her honestly I had no idea anymore. Ava had been so angry with me, so defensive of him, that I couldn't tell if she was helping him or if he'd fooled her too. The not knowing made everything worse because it meant I'd lost my sister either way, whether she was guilty or just blind. Elena wrote something down and said they'd look into Ava's involvement, but right now their focus was building the strongest case against Tyson. Detective Lombard slid my apartment keys across the table and said the crime scene was cleared and I could go back any time. I pushed the keys back toward her and said I couldn't, maybe not ever. The thought of sleeping in that bedroom where Tyson had gone through my things made my skin crawl. Detective Lombard nodded like she'd expected this and mentioned that victim services could help with relocation costs if I wanted to break my lease and find somewhere Tyson didn't know about. Dad spoke up then and offered to go pack my essential stuff with a police escort. I grabbed a notepad from Detective Lombard's desk and started writing, my hands shaking as I listed clothes, laptop, toiletries, cat supplies. When I got to the jewelry box, I stopped and looked at Dad and told him to have someone else grab it because I didn't want him touching Mom's ring after what happened. His face fell, but he understood. Detective Lombard said she'd arrange for an officer to accompany him and handle the jewelry box personally. While Dad headed to my apartment, I sat in Detective Lombard's office drinking bad coffee from a foam cup. She leaned against her desk and gently suggested I think about getting a restraining order once Tyson got out of the hospital. My chest got tight at the thought of him being mobile again, walking around free. She must have seen my face change because she quickly added that he'd be facing serious charges and probably wouldn't risk violating a protective order, but it was better to have it in place just in case. I nodded and asked how soon we could file it. Elena came back with a stack of papers and sat down next to me, explaining this was a temporary restraining order application we could file right now. She walked me through each section, her finger moving down the page as she explained that this would prohibit any contact, direct or indirect, through third parties or social media. Violation meant immediate arrest, no questions asked. The form had boxes to check for different types of prohibited behavior, and I checked almost all of them. No phone calls, no texts, no emails, no showing up at my home or work, no contact through family members. Elena added a note about the social media stalking through fake accounts and said that was covered too. I signed my name at the bottom with a pen that kept slipping in my sweaty hand. Elena took the papers and promised to fast-track them through a judge today, so the order would be active before Tyson even woke up from his pain medication. She also mentioned they were requesting high bail given the break-in, the assault on my dad, and the evidence that Tyson was a flight risk with all those gambling debts. Someone from the loan shark texts might come looking for him and he might run. Dad got back 3 hours later carrying 2 big boxes and my orange cat in her carrier. She was yowling and hissing, more upset than I'd ever seen her. At Dad's house, she shot out of the carrier and disappeared under the guest bed, refusing to come out even when I sat on the floor calling her name. Dad set the boxes down and collapsed into his recliner, and I really looked at him for the first time since this started. He looked old, older than his 58 years, with new lines around his eyes and gray stubble on his jaw. I realized he was traumatized too, that he'd had to seriously hurt someone in his daughter's apartment to keep us safe. That evening, my phone started buzzing nonstop, text after text from relatives I barely knew. Aunt Linda asking if the rumors were true. Cousin Mike wanting to know what happened. Uncle Rob saying he heard Dad beat someone up. I turned my phone completely off and asked Dad to do the same with his. He unplugged his cell from the charger and shut it down without argument. We ate leftover pizza in silence, neither of us having the energy for real food. Around 9 o'clock, Dad's landline rang and he answered it, then handed me the phone. Detective Lombard's voice was calm and professional as she told me the restraining order had been approved and an officer served it to Tyson in his hospital bed about an hour ago. She said he didn't react much because of the pain medication, but his parents were there and got very upset. They demanded to know why their son was persecuted after being attacked in someone's home. Detective Lombard said she explained very clearly that their son had broken in and attempted to steal property and that the homeowner had every right to defend his residence. I thanked her and hung up, relaying the information to Dad. He just nodded and turned back to the TV. I tried to sleep that night but kept waking up every hour, my heart pounding, convinced I heard someone at the door. At 3 a.m., I gave up and grabbed the baseball bat from Dad's hall closet, then sat in the hallway outside the guest bedroom with my back against the wall. Dad found me there 20 minutes later, probably coming to check on me. He didn't say anything, didn't ask what I was doing or tell me I was being silly. He just lowered himself down next to me, his back against the opposite wall, and we sat there together in the dark until my breathing slowed and I felt ready to try sleeping again. The next morning, my phone started buzzing on the nightstand before I was fully awake. I grabbed it and saw Elena's name on the screen. She got right to business, telling me Tyson's parents hired a defense attorney named Cameron Wolfe, who was known for getting burglary charges reduced. She explained that Cameron would probably try to make this look like a fight between exes instead of a planned break-in, and that we needed to be ready for a long court process. I thanked her and hung up, feeling my stomach twist at the thought of months of legal stuff ahead. I turned my phone back on fully for the first time since shutting it down 2 days ago, and immediately the screen filled with notifications. 47 missed calls from Ava. I scrolled through and saw she'd left a voicemail too. I pressed play and heard her crying, saying I was ruining Tyson's life over a stupid ring, that he made a mistake, but didn't deserve what Dad did to him. Her words felt like a punch to the chest, but they also made everything clear. She'd picked her side. My sister chose the guy who cheated on me and broke into my apartment over her own family. I saved the voicemail as evidence and deleted the rest of her messages without reading them. My email dinged, and I saw a new message from Detective Lombard with the subject line, Victim Services Resources. She'd sent me contact information for someone named Marissa Gutierrez, a victim advocate who could help with therapy referrals, safety planning, and understanding the court system. The email said Marissa specialized in helping people like me navigate everything that came after a crime. I saved the email to a folder but didn't call yet. The idea of adding another person to this situation, another stranger who'd want to talk about what happened, felt like too much right now. I walked out to the kitchen and found Dad already making breakfast. He had eggs going in a pan and toast in the toaster, moving around the kitchen with the same careful movements he'd used in the hallway last night. We sat down at the table and ate in total silence for almost 10 minutes. Then Dad set down his fork and looked at me with red eyes. He said he was sorry for trusting Tyson, for giving him Mom's ring to propose with, for not seeing what kind of person he really was. I told him it wasn't his fault, that Tyson had fooled both of us, but I could see the guilt sitting heavy on his shoulders anyway. He nodded, but didn't look convinced. My phone rang again, and this time it was a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a man introduced himself as Bradley Porter, an insurance investigator. He said he needed to meet with me about a fake insurance policy Tyson had taken out on Mom's ring. Bradley explained that insurance fraud was a separate crime from the burglary, and his company was building their own case against Tyson, which could mean even more charges and money Tyson would have to pay back. We set up a meeting for that afternoon at a coffee shop downtown. I drove there alone, needing some space from Dad's house and the heavy quiet that had settled over everything. Bradley was already waiting at a corner table with a thick folder in front of him. He shook my hand and got straight into it, spreading out papers across the table. He showed me the policy documents, and I felt sick looking at them. Tyson had forged my signature and Dad's signature and created completely fake paperwork from an appraiser claiming the ring was worth $85,000. Bradley said the real value was probably closer to $15,000, but Tyson had made up a huge number so he could get a bigger payout if he claimed it got stolen. Every page showed another lie, another part of his plan. Bradley asked if I had any real paperwork about the ring's actual value or where it came from. I realized I didn't have anything like that. It was Mom's ring, and after she died 6 years ago, Dad just gave it to me in a little velvet box. There was no receipt, no certificate, nothing official. Bradley suggested I get it professionally checked and documented now, both for the criminal case and to protect against anyone trying to pull this kind of fraud again. He gave me the name of a jewelry expert he trusted. I called the appraiser's office from the coffee shop parking lot and scheduled an appointment for the following week. I asked if Dad could come with me since he knew more about where Mom originally got the ring. The woman on the phone said that was fine and gave me a time slot for next Tuesday. When I got back to Dad's house that afternoon, I saw Ava's car parked on the street. I sat in my car for a minute, watching through the living room window as Dad stood at the front door talking to her. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see Ava crying on the porch, her hands moving as she talked. Dad's posture was stiff and his arms were crossed. After a few minutes, Ava's voice got louder, and I heard her say something about Tyson just trying to get what was rightfully his. Dad's whole body changed. His voice came out hard and cold in a way I'd never heard before, telling her to leave his property right now. Ava stood there for another moment, then turned and walked back to her car. She didn't look at my car as she drove past, but I saw tears running down her face. I waited until she was completely gone before getting out and going inside. Dad was standing in the middle of the living room, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. He said his heart was breaking because both his kids were hurting, but he couldn't support someone who defended what Tyson did. He couldn't watch Ava make excuses for a man who broke into his daughter's home and tried to steal from her. We moved to the couch and I leaned against his shoulder the same way I used to when I was little, and something bad happened at the school. We sat there together, not talking, both of us understanding that our family would never be the same as it was before all this started. The next morning, my phone rang while I was still in bed at Dad's house. I grabbed it off the nightstand and saw Detective Lombard's name on the screen. She got right to business, saying they pulled Tyson's bank records with a warrant and found something big. He'd lost $23,000 gambling in just the past 4 months, all charged to credit cards he couldn't pay back. The loan shark texts they found on that burner phone matched up perfectly with these timelines. Every message demanding money lined up with another gambling loss, another credit card maxed out. She said it painted a really clear picture of someone who was desperate for cash and willing to break into his ex's apartment to get it. I sat up in bed, pressing the phone harder against my ear as she kept talking. They also found search history on Tyson's laptop that made everything worse. He'd looked up how to pick a deadbolt 3 different times in the 2 weeks before the break-in. He searched for pawn shops that would give cash for jewelry without asking questions. He even looked up the insurance claim process for stolen jewelry, probably planning his backup scam in case he couldn't actually steal the ring. Detective Lombard said every single search made it more obvious that he'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months. While he was texting me every day, calling me unfair and bitter, he was literally researching how to break into my home and steal from me. I felt sick thinking about it. After I hung up with the detective, I checked my email and found a message from Elena. She'd sent me a draft victim impact statement form, explaining that I'd get the chance to speak in court about how this crime affected me. I opened the document and stared at the blank spaces for over an hour. How was I supposed to put into words the way Tyson's actions made me feel? The fear, the sense of being invaded, the loss of safety in my own home, the way my family fell apart because of his choices. Every time I tried to type something, it felt too small or too dramatic or just wrong. I saved the document without writing anything and closed my laptop. A few hours later, my phone rang again. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman introduced herself as Marissa Gutierrez. She said she was the victim advocate who'd been sending me emails, and she noticed I hadn't responded yet. Her voice was gentle but direct. She told me she was a therapist who worked specifically with crime victims, helping them deal with trauma. She offered to meet me at Dad's house if I wasn't comfortable going to an office somewhere. Something about the way she talked made me feel like she actually understood, so I agreed to meet her the next day. When Marissa showed up at Dad's house the following afternoon, she was younger than I expected, maybe in her early 30s. The first thing she did was ask about my cat, which immediately put me at ease. We sat at Dad's kitchen table and talked for 2 solid hours about everything. The relationship with Tyson, the cheating with my sister, the months of harassment about the ring, the break-in, the family situation with Ava. She never once made me feel like I was being too dramatic or making too big a deal out of things. She just listened and asked questions and took notes. Marissa explained that what I was going through was a normal response to trauma, the way I stayed alert all the time, checking locks and watching my surroundings, the trouble sleeping, waking up multiple times each night, the way I couldn't feel safe anywhere anymore, the constant replaying of events in my head, wondering what I missed or could have done differently. She said all of that made perfect sense given what happened. Then she taught me some techniques for when I felt panic starting to build, like focusing on my breathing or naming 5 things I could see around me. She gave me homework too, telling me to start writing in a journal about my feelings instead of just letting them spin around inside my head over and over. A few days later, Dad and I went to the jewelry appraiser's office for our appointment. The expert was an older guy who'd been doing this work for 30 years. He took Mom's ring and examined it under this big magnifying lens, turning it different ways and checking every detail. After about 20 minutes, he confirmed it was a quality vintage piece worth somewhere between $12,000 and $15,000. He took photographs from multiple angles and created detailed paperwork documenting everything about the ring, which Bradley Porter had said would be really important for proving the insurance fraud case. While we were sitting there watching him work, the appraiser mentioned something that made my stomach turn. He said someone had called his office last month asking about selling a ring that matched this exact description. The caller claimed it was a family ring he'd inherited and wanted to know what he could get for it. Dad and I looked at each other across the table, both of us realizing the same thing at the same moment. Tyson had been shopping around even before the break-in, trying to figure out exactly how much money he could get for Mom's ring. He'd been planning this whole thing for way longer than we thought. Detective Lombard called me later that week to confirm something else. The pawn shop owner, Eric, remembered Tyson coming into his store about 3 weeks ago. Tyson had shown him photos of a ring on his phone, asking how much cash Eric would give him for it. Eric told him he'd need to see the actual ring in person before making any offer, which was when Tyson scheduled that appointment for 2 days after my girl's trip. He'd been so sure he'd have the ring by then. The detective said Eric's statement matched up perfectly with everything else they'd found. The evidence just kept piling up, piece after piece, and while it made the case against Tyson stronger, it also made me feel incredibly stupid. How did I not see what he was planning? How did I miss all the signs that he was capable of something like this? During my next session with Marissa, I told her how dumb I felt for not figuring it out sooner. She stopped me right there and said his lying wasn't my failure. He deliberately hid what he was doing and manipulated everyone around him, which is exactly what con artists do. They're good at deception because they practice it constantly. She reminded me that even people trained to spot manipulation get fooled sometimes, so I needed to stop blaming myself for trusting someone I loved. I appreciated her helping me separate what actually happened from what I wished had happened or feared might happen. That work felt important even though it was hard. 8 days after the break-in, Detective Lombard called while I was eating breakfast at Dad's kitchen table. Tyson had been released from the hospital that morning and was staying with his parents in their house across town. The bail got set at $50,000, and his parents posted it without hesitation, which made my chest tight with anger. They were enabling him even after everything he'd done, treating him like the victim instead of the criminal who broke into my home. Detective Lombard explained that Tyson couldn't leave the county and had to check in with the court every week, but knowing he was out there walking around made my hands shake. I set down my coffee cup before I could spill it. Dad noticed and squeezed my shoulder, his way of saying he understood without making me talk about it. The detective also mentioned that Tyson's attorney had already been in touch with the prosecutor's office, which meant the legal process was moving forward whether I felt ready or not. I thanked her for letting me know and hung up, staring at my phone for a long time after. Dad asked if I wanted to talk, but I shook my head, needing to process this alone for a bit. Later that afternoon, Elena called with an update that made my stomach drop. Cameron Wolfe, the defense attorney Tyson's parents hired, had reached out about a potential plea deal. He suggested they could resolve everything quickly and avoid trial if I agreed to drop the restraining order and not pursue full prosecution. My mouth fell open at the audacity. Elena's response had been immediate and firm, she told me with satisfaction in her voice. She'd said absolutely not. They were prepared to go to trial if necessary, and she had full support from the DA's office. Hearing her defend my interests so strongly made me want to cry with relief. She explained that Cameron was doing his job by testing whether we'd accept an easy out, but our case was solid and we weren't backing down. I told her I appreciated her standing up for me because I wasn't sure I could have done it myself in that moment. She reminded me that was literally her job, and I should never feel guilty about wanting justice. We talked for another 20 minutes about what to expect in the coming weeks, and by the end I felt slightly less scared about the whole process. That evening, I started looking at apartment listings online, accepting the reality that I couldn't go back to my old place even though breaking the lease would cost me money I didn't really have. I scrolled through dozens of options in different neighborhoods, trying to find somewhere that felt safe and wasn't too expensive. Dad came into the living room and sat down next to me, looking at the laptop screen over my shoulder. He offered to help with the deposit on a new place, saying he had some savings set aside and this was exactly the kind of emergency he'd been saving for. I felt grateful, but also sad that I was forced to uproot my entire life because Tyson couldn't handle rejection and debt. We looked at apartments together for over an hour, Dad pointing out which neighborhoods had good lighting and which buildings looked secure. He approached it like a military operation, checking crime statistics and transit routes, making sure I'd be safe wherever I ended up. I appreciated his thoroughness, even though it reminded me how much danger I'd actually been in. The next day, I met with Marissa again and we started working on my victim impact statement together. She pulled out a blank document and asked me to describe the concrete ways this crime had affected my life. I started listing things, my voice getting steadier as I went. The loss of security in my own home, the family fracture with my sister that might never heal, the financial costs of moving and therapy and legal fees, the ongoing fear that Tyson might show up somewhere even with the restraining order. Marissa typed everything I said, organizing my scattered thoughts into clear statements. She reminded me I didn't have to perform grief or anger for the court, just tell the truth about my experience. The judge and jury would understand the impact without me exaggerating or making it dramatic. We spent 2 hours on the statement, and by the end I had 3 full pages of specific, honest descriptions of how the break-in had changed my life. Reading it back made me realize how much damage Tyson had actually caused beyond just the physical break-in itself. 2 weeks after the break-in, I finally went back to my apartment with Dad and a police escort to pack up everything. The officer met us in the parking lot and walked with us to the door, his presence both comforting and embarrassing. Standing in my bedroom doorway, I could see the scratches on my dresser where Tyson had rifled through my jewelry box, and my stomach turned knowing he'd touched all my personal belongings while searching for the ring. Dad put his hand on my back and asked if I needed a minute, but I shook my head and walked in. We needed to get this done quickly before I lost my nerve. I started pulling clothes out of my closet while Dad grabbed boxes from his truck. The apartment felt different now, violated and unsafe, like it belonged to someone else's life. I worked mechanically, folding shirts and pants without really seeing them, just wanting to be done and out of here forever. We packed everything in 6 hours, working methodically through each room. Dad handled the kitchen while I dealt with the bedroom and bathroom, neither of us talking much except to ask where things should go. My cat stayed in his carrier the whole time, meowing occasionally, but mostly just watching us with worried eyes. When we finished, I left the keys with the building manager along with a letter breaking my lease under the domestic violence clause. The manager read it quickly and looked up at me with sympathy, saying she was sorry this happened and she'd waive the penalty fees. That one small relief in an ocean of stress made my eyes burn with tears I wouldn't let fall. I thanked her and walked out, not looking back at the apartment where I'd lived for 3 years and planned a future that would never happen. I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in a building with security cameras and a doorman, paying extra for the safety features that suddenly felt necessary. The rent was higher than my old place, but Dad helped me figure out a budget that would work. He spent the entire first day helping me set up, insisting on installing additional locks and a security bar for the door. His military precision showed in how thoroughly he checked every window and entry point, testing locks multiple times and making notes about sight lines and escape routes. I watched him work and felt safer than I had in weeks, knowing he'd made this place as secure as possible. We arranged furniture to maximize visibility and minimize blind spots, Dad explaining his reasoning for each choice. By evening, the apartment felt like a fortress, and I could finally breathe a little easier knowing Tyson didn't know where I lived anymore. 3 days later, Detective Lombard emailed to say they'd completed their investigation and the DA's office was moving forward with formal charges: first-degree burglary, attempted grand theft, forgery, and insurance fraud. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, and I'd need to testify about our relationship history and the harassment leading up to the break-in. I read the email twice, my heart pounding at the thought of facing Tyson in court. Elena called shortly after to walk me through what the hearing would involve, explaining that it was just to establish probable cause, not the actual trial. She'd be there with me the whole time and would prepare me beforehand so I'd know exactly what to expect. I marked the date on my calendar with shaking hands, already dreading it but knowing I had to follow through. A week later, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Ava, using a new number I hadn't blocked yet. The message said we needed to talk because there were things about Tyson I didn't know. I stared at it for a full day, not sure how to respond or if I even wanted to. Part of me was curious about what she had to say, but another part was exhausted by the whole situation and didn't want to hear her defend him again. Finally, I responded with just my new address, telling her she could come by once, but if she was here to defend him, she should save us both the time. She replied immediately, saying she'd be there the next evening at 7. When Ava arrived at my new apartment, she looked terrible, exhausted and thin, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. She stood in my doorway for a moment like she wasn't sure I'd actually let her in, then walked slowly to my couch when I gestured. We sat in awkward silence for a minute before she started talking in a rush. Tyson had been pressuring her to get money from our dad, claiming he needed it for legal fees, but she suspected it was actually for gambling debts. She'd found betting apps on his phone and confronted him about it, and he'd gotten angry in a way that scared her. His voice had changed, she said, becoming cold and mean. Nothing like the person she thought she knew. She admitted she'd been stupid to believe his lies about the ring, about me, about everything. She pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots of betting apps with thousands of dollars in losses, her hands shaking as she scrolled through the evidence. Tyson had been placing bets on sports games, casino apps, even online poker, and the numbers kept climbing into amounts that made my stomach turn. When she confronted him about it 3 days ago, his whole face changed into something cold and mean, and he grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave marks when she tried to walk away. Ava started crying then, really crying. Not the fake tears she'd used when defending him before, and admitted she knew she destroyed our relationship by sleeping with him, but was starting to see how he manipulated both of us. She said she felt trapped now, living with him at his parents' house, watching him get angry over small things, seeing a side of him that scared her. I sat there feeling this weird mix of anger at her for what she did, and genuine worry for her safety, because even though she betrayed me, I didn't want her hurt by the same person who broke into my apartment. I told her honestly that I couldn't help her with Tyson, that I had my own healing to do, and couldn't be her support system right now, but I could give her Marissa's contact information if she wanted to talk to someone who specialized in this stuff. Ava took the number and saved it in her phone, then apologized again, and I told her I needed time before I could even think about rebuilding trust between us, that forgiveness wasn't something I could offer right now. She nodded and left quietly, and I locked the door behind her, feeling exhausted from the conversation, but also relieved that at least she was starting to see the truth. 3 weeks later, I walked into the courthouse for the preliminary hearing with Dad beside me and Elena meeting us at the entrance. The building was all marble floors and high ceilings, with security checkpoints and metal detectors that made everything feel official and serious. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor and found the courtroom, where Tyson was already sitting at the defense table looking pale and thin, using a cane to support himself from the injuries Dad had given him. Cameron sat next to him in an expensive suit, shuffling papers and looking confident in a way that made me nervous. The judge entered and everyone stood. Then we sat back down and the hearing began with Cameron arguing that this was just a misunderstanding between exes who were both emotional about a breakup. He claimed the force my dad used was way too much for the situation, that Tyson was just trying to retrieve property he believed was rightfully his, and that the criminal charges were an overreaction. But the judge looked unimpressed, flipping through the evidence photos of the lockpick kit, the forged insurance documents, and the timeline showing Tyson had planned this for weeks. Elena stood and calmly presented the facts about premeditation, fraud, and the months of harassment I'd documented, and I could see the judge nodding along as she spoke. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand and swore to tell the truth, my voice steadier than I expected. For 40 minutes, I talked about the relationship, finding out about the cheating, the breakup, and the constant harassment about the ring that followed. I described how Tyson showed up at my work, sent daily texts, and made my life miserable for 3 months while I tried to move on. Cameron tried to interrupt several times, suggesting I was being vindictive and keeping the ring just to hurt Tyson, but Elena objected each time and the judge sustained it. The judge even looked at Cameron and reminded him that the ring legally belonged to me regardless of any relationship drama, that ownership wasn't up for debate here. I felt this small surge of validation hearing the judge say that, like finally someone in authority was confirming I wasn't crazy for refusing to hand over my dead mom's ring. Cameron asked if I'd ever offered to return it, and I said no, because it was mine and Tyson had no right to it, especially after cheating on me with my own sister. The courtroom went quiet for a moment, and I saw Tyson look down at the table, unable to meet my eyes. After my testimony, the judge reviewed all the evidence and found probable cause for every single charge against Tyson. She scheduled the trial for 2 months out and denied Cameron's motion to reduce bail, saying the evidence of premeditation and fraud was too strong to justify any leniency. Tyson's parents, who I hadn't noticed sitting in the back row, stood up looking furious, whispering angrily to each other as the judge finished speaking. Dad and I left through a side door with a security escort that Elena had arranged, and I felt grateful for the protection as we walked to our car in the parking garage. The escort stayed with us until we were safely inside with the doors locked, and only then did I let myself breathe normally again. Over the next few weeks, I settled into my new apartment and built routines that helped me feel safer in my own space. I checked the locks twice every night before bed, tested the windows to make sure they were secure, and kept my phone charged and nearby at all times. I varied my schedule for going to work and coming home, never leaving or arriving at exactly the same time 2 days in a row. I stayed aware of my surroundings when I walked to my car, looking around the parking lot before getting in, checking the back seat before starting the engine. Marissa told me during our sessions that this kind of watching everything was normal right now, that my brain was trying to protect me after what happened, and that the constant alertness would fade with time as I felt safer. I wanted to believe her, but some nights I still woke up convinced I heard someone at my door, and it took forever to fall back asleep. Bradley called one afternoon to let me know he'd completed his insurance fraud investigation and filed a separate report with the State Insurance Commission. He explained that Tyson could face additional fines and penalties beyond the criminal charges because insurance fraud was taken seriously by regulators who wanted to discourage this kind of behavior. He said prosecutors often went after fraud cases hard because it drove up premiums for everyone, making it a crime that affected way more people than just the direct victim. I thanked him for his work and hung up feeling like at least the system was taking this seriously, even if it couldn't undo what happened. I started going back to work half days, easing into normal life again without pushing myself too hard too fast. My coworkers were supportive without being nosy, asking how I was doing but not pressing for details when I kept my answers vague. My boss pulled me aside one morning and mentioned they'd updated the visitor policy to require ID and staff approval for anyone who wasn't an employee, which made me feel safer knowing Tyson couldn't just show up during my lunch break anymore like he used to. The new policy meant security would stop him at the front desk and call me before letting him up, giving me the power to refuse to see him. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Ava started texting occasionally with updates about her own therapy progress, and I responded politely but kept clear boundaries about what I was willing to discuss. I didn't ask about Tyson, didn't offer advice about her situation, just acknowledged that she was working on herself and left it at that. During one of my sessions, Marissa brought up the possibility of family therapy down the road, maybe in 6 months or a year, but I told her I wasn't ready yet, and she supported that decision completely. She reminded me that healing had to happen on my timeline, not anyone else's, and that I didn't owe Ava forgiveness just because she was my sister. 2 days later, Elena called and said Cameron had contacted her again with a more serious plea offer. Tyson would plead guilty to burglary and fraud in exchange for dropping the assault charges against my dad and a recommendation for probation instead of prison time. She presented it carefully, making it clear the decision was ours to make, but that she thought we had a strong case for trial if we wanted to push forward. I told her I needed to talk to Dad before deciding anything, and she said to take the time we needed and call her back when we were ready. Dad and I sat at his kitchen table that night with coffee going cold in our mugs, talking through every angle of the plea offer until my head hurt from thinking about it. He kept pointing out that a trial could drag on for months, and there was always a chance the jury might not see things our way, even with all the evidence we had. I kept circling back to how 5 years of probation felt like nothing compared to what Tyson had put me through, how he'd get to walk around free while I was still dealing with the aftermath of his choices. We went back and forth for 3 hours, weighing the certainty of getting a conviction against the emotional cost of sitting through weeks of testimony and cross-examination. Part of me wanted to see Tyson squirm on the witness stand, wanted the jury to hear every detail of his manipulation and lies, but another part just wanted this whole nightmare to be over so I could finally move on. Dad reminded me that even with probation, Tyson would have a permanent felony record that would follow him for life, affecting job prospects and housing applications and everything else. I scheduled an emergency session with Marissa the next morning because I couldn't make this decision without working through all the complicated feelings it brought up. She listened while I vented about wanting maximum consequences for Tyson, but also desperately wanting to stop spending every day thinking about him and what he did. Marissa pointed out something I hadn't considered, that accepting the plea didn't mean I was letting him off easy or being weak. She walked me through what probation actually meant, the requirements he'd have to meet, the monitoring he'd be under, the restitution he'd owe. She reminded me that closure comes from inside, from healing and moving forward, not from watching someone else suffer the exact punishment we think they deserve. That hit me hard because I realized I'd been treating the severity of his sentence like it would somehow undo the violation I felt, like more jail time would magically make me feel safe again. Marissa helped me see that my healing had to happen separately from whatever consequences the legal system imposed on Tyson. Over the next week, Dad and I kept talking about it, looking at it from every direction until we both felt ready to make a decision. I called Elena and told her we'd accept the plea, but only with specific conditions that had to be non-negotiable. Tyson had to plead guilty to every single charge, no reduced counts or dismissed charges. He had to complete a full gambling addiction treatment program, not just attend a few meetings. He had to pay restitution for my moving costs, my therapy bills, and all the other expenses his break-in caused. The restraining order had to become permanent, not just the temporary one we had now. Elena wrote everything down and said she'd take it to Cameron and see what they could agree on. 2 days later, she called back saying Cameron agreed to all our conditions except the exact restitution amount, which the judge would decide based on documentation I provided. That felt fair enough, and I told Elena we'd accept those terms. The plea hearing got scheduled for the following week, which felt incredibly fast after months of waiting, and suddenly I had to prepare myself to face Tyson in court one final time. Marissa spent our next session coaching me on how to stay grounded during the hearing, reminding me to focus on my own statement and not get distracted by Tyson's reactions or excuses. She taught me breathing techniques to use if I felt panic rising, and reminded me that his emotions were not my responsibility to manage or worry about. I practiced reading my victim impact statement out loud in her office until I could get through it without my voice shaking too badly. The morning of the plea hearing, Dad drove us to the courthouse and we sat in the hallway outside the courtroom waiting for our turn. My hands wouldn't stop trembling and I kept running through my statement in my head, terrified I'd forget the words or break down crying in front of everyone. When they called us in, I walked through those courtroom doors and saw Tyson standing at the defense table next to Cameron, looking smaller somehow than I remembered. The judge asked him to state his plea, and Tyson's voice came out quiet and flat as he said guilty to first-degree burglary, guilty to attempted grand theft, guilty to forgery, guilty to insurance fraud. He didn't look at me once during any of it, just kept his eyes down on the table, and I felt a small surge of satisfaction that he couldn't even face what he'd done. The judge turned to me and asked if I wanted to make a statement before sentencing, and I stood up with my paper shaking in my hands. I read every word I'd prepared, describing how Tyson's actions had violated my sense of safety in my own home, how his choices had fractured my relationship with my sister, how I'd been forced to move and change my entire life because of his desperation and selfishness. I made sure to emphasize that this wasn't about a relationship gone wrong or a dispute over property. This was about his willingness to hurt people and break laws to solve his own problems. When I finished and sat down, the judge took a moment to review the case file before announcing Tyson's sentence. 5 years probation with strict compliance requirements. 500 hours of community service to be completed within the first 2 years. Mandatory enrollment and completion of a gambling addiction treatment program. Restitution in the amount of $8,500 to cover my moving expenses, therapy costs, and other documented losses. The permanent restraining order was granted, meaning Tyson couldn't contact me or come within 500 feet of my home or workplace for the next 10 years. As we left the courthouse, I felt something shift inside me, like a weight I'd been carrying finally got set down. It wasn't perfect justice, and it definitely didn't undo what happened or make me forget, but it was accountability and closure, which turned out to be exactly what I needed most. Over the following weeks, I watched as Tyson began checking in with his probation officer and attending his required programs. The first restitution payment came through the court system, deposited directly into my account, and seeing that money felt like validation that the system had actually worked. Detective Lombard called one afternoon just to check in and mentioned that Tyson's probation officer had a reputation for being strict and thorough, which gave me additional peace of mind knowing someone was monitoring his compliance closely. 3 months after the plea hearing, I got a text from Ava asking if we could meet for coffee, saying she had things she needed to tell me. I almost deleted it without responding, but something made me agree to meet at a neutral coffee shop halfway between our places. When I arrived, Ava was already sitting at a corner table looking nervous and tired, and I could tell immediately that something had changed. We ordered our drinks and sat down, and the awkwardness between us felt thick and uncomfortable. She started by saying she wasn't with Tyson anymore, that she'd ended things a month ago when she finally saw him for what he really was. She told me she'd been going to therapy regularly and working on understanding why she made the choices she did. I listened without interrupting, trying to figure out if this was genuine or just another manipulation. Ava said she knew rebuilding trust between us would take years, maybe forever, and she wasn't expecting me to forgive her right away, or maybe ever. She just wanted me to know she was committed to her own recovery, and to being honest about the damage she'd caused. We agreed to take things slowly, with clear boundaries and regular communication, both acknowledging that our relationship might never be what it was before, but maybe it could become something different and healthier. A few weeks later, Dad started going to a veterans support group that met every Thursday evening at the community center downtown. I noticed the change in him gradually, like watching ice melt in slow motion. He stopped apologizing every time we talked about that night, stopped flinching when someone mentioned Tyson's name. The tight set of his shoulders loosened bit by bit with each meeting he attended. One evening, about 2 months into his group sessions, Dad came over to my new apartment for dinner, and we sat on my small balcony watching the sunset. He told me quietly that he'd do it all again to protect me, that he had no regrets about stopping Tyson that night. But he also said he was grateful to have people who understood the complicated feelings that came with using force, even justified force, against another person. The group gave him space to process the guilt and the righteousness all tangled together. 6 months after the break-in, I found myself genuinely settled in my new apartment with my orange cat curled up on the couch beside me. I kept my weekly therapy appointments with Marissa and actually looked forward to them now. Mom's ring sat secure in a safety deposit box at my bank, and while I didn't wear it yet, knowing it was protected and waiting for me felt right. I learned that healing doesn't follow a straight line, and justice doesn't always feel as satisfying as you imagine it will. But setting boundaries and choosing my own safety over everyone else's comfort was the right choice. I was proud of how I handled one of the worst experiences of my life, and that pride felt solid and real in a way nothing else had for a long time.